Hey everybody, I'm Noah Rosenfield. I work as a developer for Scholastic Magazines, and I'm also the game designer and developer for Tilt. I'm going to try to answer all of the questions that you guys sent me and talk about a couple of other things related to making games. So let's just jump right in. So the first questions were how do you go about creating a video game and what are the steps involved? The first step in creating a video game is figuring out what you're making. Sometimes it can be a brand new idea for a game, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes you can just remake an old game with some new rules. And that's the same for all games, not just video games. You can do that with board games or card games or anything really. For example, let's try making Tic Tac Toe with some new rules. Instead of a 3x3 grid, let's try a 2x2 grid. So once we have an idea, the next step is to make a small test or a prototype. And sometimes our rules aren't going to work out very well, so we have to go back to the original idea and make some changes. So let's test out the 2x2 grid for tic-tac-toe, right? So the first player is going to go, okay, then the second player goes, and then no matter what happens, the first player is going to win right there on that third turn. There's no way to have a different outcome. It's just whoever goes first is always going to win. And that's not a very good game. So now we go back to our original idea and we try to modify it. So let's say instead of going to, making the grid smaller, what if we made it bigger? What about tic-tac-toe with a 4x4 grid? And so then we test that out and we see how that works. We keep doing that and adding new rules and testing them to make sure that each thing we add works the way that we thought it would and that it makes the game more fun. And eventually we can start to add in art and music and the other things that enhance the overall the game, make it more fun and more enjoyable. So the next questions were how hard is it to program and what skills do you need? Learning a programming language is a lot like learning a foreign language, except you're talking to the computer. You're asking it to do things, and it's pretty easy to learn a few words or phrases. So, for example, you might already know how to say hello or please and thank you in another language without ever taking a language class. But if you need to give someone directions to the school, that's much harder and would require a lot more practice. So, that's the same thing with a programming language. It's easy to do the simple things, but it takes more practice to do the more complex things. But writing a program is actually very easy. You don't even need a computer to do it. What a program really is you give it input, it applies rules, and it gives you output. So for example, in a game, the input might be pressing the jump button, right? And the rule is, if the player is on the ground, then jump. And if the player's already in the air, then don't jump again while he's in the air. Just, wait until you have to wait until he hits the ground again. And then, so the output is either the player jumping or nothing. An even simpler example of that is, let's say we have a program and the input is any number. The rule is add 5 to it, and the output is that new number. So this is an example of a simple program, but it's not a very fun program. But we can use this same idea to make something that is a little more fun. So sometimes you'll have a situation where we know what the input is and we know what the output is, but we don't know the rules. And the goal is to figure out what the rules are. That's called reverse engineering, and that can be a game in and of itself. So right now I'm going to give on the screen here, I'm going to put some input, okay? And I've come up with a set of rules that I'm using to change these numbers, and then I'm going to put the output over here. I'll tell you what the rules are at the end of the video, but before then, you can pause it and see if you can figure out what the rules are that I'm using to change these numbers. So you can do the same thing yourself also. Instead of choosing the input like I have here, you can just have your friends give you the input. So you ask them, give me a number, and then you apply the rule that you know that you've made up, and you tell them the output, and then they have to guess what the rule is. The next question is, what skills do you need? Reading is always going to be an important skill so that you can learn from other people. If I run into a problem that I don't know how to solve when I'm programming, the first thing that I do is I look it up. I go online and I search to see how other people have tried to solve it. And I am reading about their experiences and what they did to solve the problem. However, if I can't understand what someone else is trying to tell me, I won't be able to learn from them. So, reading is definitely important. When it comes to playing a game, if I can't read and understand the rules, then I probably won't be able to play it, or I might not have as much fun. Let's say let's say my character has a special ability, and there's a way to activate it, but I couldn't read the instructions, so I was never able to use it. I'm not going to have as much fun. And on the other side of that, if I can't explain the game to you, then it probably won't work very well. Writing good instructions can help people learn how to play more quickly and have more fun. It's also important if you have to try to get someone else to join you in making your game. So for me, I'm not great at drawing, and so I had to talk with Danny and explain my idea and convince him to join me in making this game. If I can't do a good job of explaining the idea and convincing someone to help me, then I'm going to get stuck. Math is always going to be an important part of programming because it's almost always involved in making the rules. With our reverse engineering game that we had earlier, if I can't do the math to tell you what the output was, or if I tell you the wrong output because I did my math wrong, then the game won't work. And if we think about our jumping player again, one way that we could determine if the player can jump is using coordinates. So when we hit the jump button, if the y coordinate of the player is the same as the y coordinate of the ground, then I know that the player is on the ground and we can jump. If the y coordinate of the player is greater, then the player must be in the air. So when we press the button, we shouldn't do anything again. It should just continue the jump that's already happening. There are a couple other things that help with making games. One is creativity, coming up with ideas for new games and new rules. Critical thinking and reasoning. Do the rules make sense, and do they work the way we expected? Third thing is communication, and that's explaining the game to others, making sure that people understand how to play. Teamwork is really important also. It's very rare that a game gets made by just one person. Being able to work together towards a common goal is very important. And finally, commitment. You usually have to try a bunch of times to get it right. Sometimes that can be frustrating, but if you don't stick with it, then you won't finish, and nobody will ever get to play your awesome game that you had an idea for. So, have to stick with it. Did you make mistakes along the way designing Tilt? How long did it take, and how many lines of code does Tilt have? I made a lot of mistakes. Programmers make mistakes all the time, which is what we call a bug. And that's a problem with the code that we wrote. Sometimes it's as simple as a typo. I don't know if you remember how we talked about programming language being like any foreign language. Well, if we use the wrong word, then the computer doesn't understand what we're trying to say. For instance, if I wanted to say turn right, but I accidentally said turn straight, that doesn't really make any sense, and the program doesn't know what to do. So that's one kind of mistake. But let's say instead I still wanted to say turn right, but I got my directions mixed up and I said turn left. The computer understands what I'm saying, but it's not going to do what I wanted it to do. This happens all the time, and part of being a good programmer is tracking down your bugs and your mistakes like that and fixing them, and that's called debugging. Tilt took me about 3 years to make, and that's from the first time I had the idea for it to when we released the game. And that's probably longer than average because it was my first game, so I was still learning how to program while I was trying to make it. And all in all, Tilt is about 10,000 lines of code. The next questions were all about money. Can you make a lot of money creating video games or apps? What's the average amount of money you can make? Why did I choose to have Tilt cost money? And the advantages and disadvantages of having ads in your game. So, video games can make a lot of money, but that's not the average experience for most independent developers. Some of the biggest games make enough money to support an entire company all on their own. But most of the apps you see in the App Store don't make enough to support even one person. But there are jobs, like my job at Scholastic, that don't rely on the success of a single game. The games in the magazines are just one small part of why people buy the magazine. And so I get a chance to make games that if one of them doesn't do as well, it's not make or break for me. I decided to charge for Tilt because I wanted to make some money to pay for the things that I use to make games, like my computer and the software and art. Some games use ads to make money, and you get a little bit of money every time someone sees an ad, but it takes a lot more people to generate the same amount of money. So for instance, let's say you get $1 from one person buying the game versus 1 cent from one person seeing an ad. You'd need 100 people to see that ad to get that same dollar. There's a lot of discussion about what the best way to make money from games is, and I'm still trying to learn how best to do that. But one thing that everyone agrees on is that the first step to making any money is to create a fun and engaging game. I didn't use ads because Danny and I put a lot of time into the game and into the artwork especially, and you can't control what an ad looks like when it's in your game. So for me, it was like spending all this time making a painting and then having someone come and stand in front of it with a big ugly sign, and I didn't want that. As a gamer, I also don't like ads, so I didn't want that to be the experience for people playing our game. Up next is what made you want to create a video game, and are you in the process of creating any other games? I've always been big into games, whether it's video games, board games, card games, and I've also always really liked mechanical puzzles, like this one here. So the way this works is there's all these little pieces that you can take out, and then the entire puzzle will come apart. Problem with those is once you figure them out, it's the same solution every time. So I wanted to make something that was similar to that, but wouldn't run out of challenges. So the easiest way that I saw to do that was to take the same idea as that and turn it into a video game. I'm working on a couple different projects now. One of them is about a puzzle-solving cat with 9 lives. One is a kind of racing game where you have to draw the racetrack. And I'm also working on my first board game. The next thing was, can you show us an example of what code looks like? So code looks different depending on what language you're writing in. Here's some of the code for Tilt. This particular piece of code has to do with setting up the blocks that slide around at each level. Two of the most important and commonly used pieces of programming are called if statements and loops. An if statement is a yes or no question that runs a different piece of code depending on the answer, such as, is the player on the ground? Or is the player's health greater than 0? A loop is like an if statement, except it will continue to run the same piece of code over and over again while that same condition is true. For instance, in a racing game, the question might be, is the player pressing the gas? If the answer is yes, move the car. But we don't want to just move the car once, so we use a loop that says, while the player is pressing the gas, move the car. If statements and loops can be helpful when you're trying to write down your own game rules. Why did I pick a hedgehog as a character for the game? Making the character a hedgehog came after I had part of the game built out. I had this ball rolling around, and so I tried to think of animals that could turn themselves into balls, and that led me to a hedgehog, and it was pretty cute also. Do you have the same illustrator each time you create a game, and how do you choose the right person to help you? For the games we make at Scholastic, we use many different illustrators. Sometimes you want the game to have a specific style or a look, so you try to find an illustrator who can draw in that style. Some of our Scholastic games are also illustrated by Danny, who did the illustrations for Tilt. Do you see a Tilt 2 in your future? What kinds of modifications will you make with Tilt? I learned a lot while making Tilt, and I'd like to use both the things I learned and the mistakes that I made to help me make a second one. Some of the ideas I've had for new rules are things like blocks that you could break, blocks that will stick together, and tunnels that the character can travel through. And finally, we've got, do I have any advice for you if you want to make games? There are many different pieces involved in making a game. Don't be afraid to try things just because they're new to you. Whether it's programming or drawing or writing the rules, it might seem hard at first, but you might be really good at it, or you might just enjoy the challenge. And you don't have to do it all yourself. Coming up with the idea and the rules, making the art, the music, the programming, if you are interested in any one of them, try it out. And if you like it, keep practicing and learning. Then you can team up with other people who enjoy doing the other parts that you don't. Okay, so this is the part of the video where I'm going to tell you what the rule was that I used to get the outputs for our reverse engineering problem earlier. So if you still need some time to take a look at it and you want to figure it out, I'll give you a chance to pause the video now. Okay, and so the rule was take the input, divide it by 3, and output the remainder. And that was the rule. So that's all the questions. If you have any other questions about something I talked about today or something that I didn't talk about, if I missed something, you can go ahead and ask your teacher and she can get in touch with me. I hope you guys learned a little bit about making games, and I hope that you want to go give it a try. So good luck, and I'll see you later.